Welcome back to another one of my memorable tournament experiences. My name's Tom Shupe, and I'm an expert level tournament player and award-winning coach from Alexandria, Virginia. There's no better way to improve your game, form lasting friendships, and create unforgettable memories than by joining the U.S. Chess Federation and taking your game over the board. So today I'd like to share with you perhaps my most memorable tournament experience. And this was a game where I finally, after many years of hard work, broke through the USCF 2000 rating barrier and became an expert. So my opponent in this game played pawn to e4, and I came to win on the black pieces. Okay, so the Sicilian defense is a great choice for a situation like this, creating an imbalance early in the game where I have great counterattacking chances and can play for a win. And after knight f3, d6, d4, open Sicilian on the board, I play the Najdorf variation. Just the Rolls Royce of chess openings. Of course, world champions Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov were huge proponents of this opening, and for great reason. Black gets a great stake in the center, great development for his pieces, and great attacking chances. So I was thrilled that I got this opening on the board in this game, and it wasn't a London system or something else I was dreading. We got a real fight on our hands, which was exactly what I wanted. So after bishop e3, I play e5, the classic Najdorf move here. I was really expecting, before I move on to my move, I was really expecting my opponent to play the English attack with f3, queen d2, and castles along. But after bishop e6, gaining key control over the d5 square. Okay, if there's one downside with the classic Najdorf move e5 as opposed to playing the more modest e6, it does create a weak square on d5 that white can look to exploit. But my opponent understood the importance of the square but just hopped into it prematurely, because now I'm able to capture on d5, and look what happened. White is forced to recapture with the pawn instead of a piece. So now this d5 square is no longer available to any of white pieces, and it does make white's position less active. So even as of move 9 here, I was starting to feel very confident about my position. So I just continue with my natural development, knight d7, bishop e2, bishop e7, queen d2. I was anticipating my opponent going to the queen side here, so I played rook c8. A great move to make, and an important one to know for all Sicilian players. The half-open c-file, you need to get your rook to c8, okay, because so much of black's counterplay, so much of black's activity stems from this great asset in the position. Now, my opponent should definitely look to castle here. Instead, he made a rather dubious move with his knight, moving it for the second time in the opening to the edge of the board. As we all know, knights on the rim are dim, or grim, however you want to say it. So it does attack my pawn on b7. I think my opponent was really hoping I would play a move, an anti-positional move like b5, trying to defend my pawn when he would be able to slam this knight into c6. But of course, I understood the importance of this pawn on b7, especially with the knight buzzing around my queen side, so I just played queen c7. Okay, developing my queen to its best square, defending b7, and putting pressure on the c-file. So, good multi-purpose move. My opponent defended with rook c1, and we both castled. So, my rooks are connected, and I'm ready to look for concrete action and counterplay. So anytime you're coming up with candidate moves, a great question to ask yourself is, what's my worst place piece? How can I improve it? So I noticed that given this pawn structure, since this pawn was on d5, I have really no chance of playing d5. So I need to look for more active prospects for my dark squared bishop. So that's why I decided to play bishop d8. Okay, and my idea is to reroute this bishop to challenge white's dark square bishop on this diagonal. Comes with the added benefit of winning a tempo because now this knight on a5 is on prise. Now, I really expected in this position my opponent to retreat, but instead he compounded his error by playing pawn to b4. Sometimes chess players have a really hard time admitting that their last move was bad and just retracting it if they can. But now he's made a move that he can't take back. b4 is a mistake that can't be fixed because pawns don't move backwards, as you know. So, I'll turn it over to you in this position. After the next maneuver I found, I gained an advantage in the initiative and really never looked back. So, have a think. What is black's best idea in this position? So this pawn advance b4, as I've highlighted, it's critically weakened the c3 square along the c file. White would love to make use of his queenside pawn majority and push c5 and really get that play going on that side of the board. But I'm able to activate my pieces and completely blockade the c-pawn by playing knight e4. Great move, gaining time on the queen, and then slamming this knight down on the c3 square. And this is an outpost. This is an octopus knight that's really difficult to remove. Okay, notice that the pawns on the D and B file have already advanced, so they can't challenge the knight. The c2 pawn is blockaded, which means the rook on c1 is a dumb piece and is very inactive. And we still have this problem knight on the side of the board. So I was feeling very, very confident in this position and was already thinking about a win. But of course, at that point, I stopped myself, regained my focus, and just took it one move at a time. So that's the best advice that I can offer you in big games like this. Don't get ahead of yourself. The hardest game to win is a one game, as Emmanuel Lasker said. So take your time, try to find the best move in every position. So that's what I did. So his A pawn was on prise, so he defended it with pawn to A3. And now I knew I needed to look for play on the king side. Why? Well, my pawn structure was telling me. Okay, notice my D and E pawns are pointing towards the king side. That's where I have more space. That's where my pieces can find activity and scope. So I borrowed an idea from the King's Indian defense and pushed the F pawn. And I'm just going to look to take these mobile pawns on F5 and E5 and just rush them down the board if my opponent will let me. He plays F3. Okay. And I think his idea here was to create an escape square, a bolt hole for the bishop if I pushed F4. But for the time being, I really just wanted to keep these pawns side by side because they control so many key squares in my opponent's position. So I just developed my knight to F6, right? That was my worst placed piece. I wanted to get it active. So I brought it to the F6 square, and now my opponent is hard pressed to defend this pawn on D5. Okay. Notice this knight. My opponent would love to bring a rook to the D file to lend this pawn some support, perhaps, or maybe get this bishop in defense, but his pieces are just too uncoordinated to do it, thanks in no small part to this awesome knight on C3. So he played bishop G5, and I simply took on D5. Okay, so this diagonal on the A2, G8 diagonal is a little weak. Okay, anytime you move the F pawn, it does critically weaken some squares around your king, but I knew that white wasn't in great position to take advantage of this, so I happily took on D5. And my opponent decided to exchange bishops, which I was happy to see because I thought, going back to this position, that his dark square bishop had much more potential than my dark square bishop, just because mine is hemmed in a little bit by my central pawn structure of D6, E5. So I was happy to see this move, and I just simply recaptured with the rook. And my opponent played bishop D1 in this position. Not exactly sure why he played this move. Perhaps to lend more support to the c-pawn. Perhaps he was worried about me capturing on e2, but if you look, I mean, there is no way that I am giving up this octopus knight for this sad, sad piece on e2. It's just not happening. So I think my opponent would have been better served just continuing with development, perhaps like rook fe1, just lending some more support to this e2 bishop. So I play rook f8 with the idea of a nice rook lift on the king side, okay? The other thing that this f-pawn does, not only controls a lot of space, but allows this maneuver to become possible. So we both tuck our kings into the corner. My opponent now plays rook e1. I think he should have played that instead of bishop d1, personally. And then I play rook f6. So I'm ready at a moment's notice to swing my rook over to the g6 or h6 square and use it as an attacking piece against the king. My opponent finally admits his mistake and brings the knight back to b3, but by now the damage had been done. It's just too little too late to try to get this piece back into the game. Okay, I brought the knight into f4, another great square for my knight, gaining time on the queen. Queen e3, I play rook g6. As I mentioned, I'm now coordinating attack on the g2 square, which my opponent defended. And I'll turn it over to you for the last move. After this move, my opponent was so disgusted with his position that he resigned. So what I would ask from you is to come up with an idea, not necessarily the concrete move, because there are a lot of good moves for black in this position. But what should we be looking to do in this position to make our attack basically indefensible? Pause your videos, have a think. So we can't get a decisive attack going on the king side without Her Majesty, the Queen. Okay, she has done her duty on the c-file, really pacified a lot of white's pieces. Now it's time to activate her, and that's precisely why I played Queen d8. So it's funny that I end up bringing the queen back to her starting square, and this prompted resignation from my opponent. This queen is on a highway to the king side. I'm either going to bring her to g5 or h4, force a weakening of the king side pawn structure, and then just break through. And white has hardly a move to make in this position. This rook can't move. This rook has nothing to do. This knight has no active prospects. It's almost as if white is in zugzwang in this position. So understandably, that's why my opponent resigned. And with it, I finally achieved my goal of breaking 2,000 USCF. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Perhaps my biggest takeaway from this game, was not anything about the opening or really anything to do with the chess strategy. Just reflecting back on it, I just encourage all of you guys, especially you young players, to really enjoy the journey. A lot of the players I come across in the tournament scene here, and a lot of my students are just so anxious to get to that next milestone. Like, when am I going to be 1,000? When am I going to be a Class A player? When am I going to be an expert or a master? Enjoy the journey, because that's really, looking back on it, that's really what was most rewarding to me. It wasn't the number, 2,000. It was all the great victories, difficult losses, interesting people, and great friends that I met along the way that made it such an enjoyable, worthwhile experience. So I really hope in your own play that you keep that perspective. So thanks again so much for watching, and don't forget, take your game over the board, join the U.S. Chess Federation, and go play some chess.